Hi, this is Tom Sedlak, General Manager at 33rd Company Property Management. Thanks so much for watching this video podcast series. Today's topic is how to evict a tenant in Kansas City. And of course, in Kansas City, you have to be aware of which state you're in because the laws are different depending on the state. But in general, the eviction process is very similar. The first thing you have to remember when there is an issue where you are considering the requirement to evict a tenant is to also know that bad tenancy, whether it's in the form of late payments or non-payments or damages. But bad tenancy is not like fine wine. It doesn't get better with age, and it's best to rip the Band-Aid off and move on, find yourself a new tenant that's a better tenant, do a better job of screening, do a better job of going through the process of ensuring that you have responsible adults moving into your home, and move forward. Trying to limp along with a bad tenant is never a good idea, and in fact will probably cause more damage to property and cash flow than simply by ripping off that Band-Aid, as I say, and moving forward briskly and finding a new tenant and mitigating the entire situation. Certainly there are a lot of reasons for evictions in the Kansas City metro area. If there's a tenant holdover, if they've gone beyond the actual stipulated end date of a lease, that's considered a holdover. That would be a reason for an eviction. Non-payment of rent, obviously. Damages, violations of the lease, and those would be material violations. And make sure that your lease language suggests certain things as a material violation of the lease, because some judges will interpret damages or lease violations as non-material. They're incidental violations. For instance, the pet that's 3 pounds overweight would not be considered a material violation that would support evicting the tenant. So little things like that you need to be aware of, and certainly the lease language will be very helpful in conjunction with the statutory obligations of the tenant in terms of determining whether something is going to affect a proper eviction. Drug use and illegal activities, that's a no-brainer, and other crimes. Certainly you don't want any of that going on, and in fact all of the states, including Kansas and Missouri, are very sympathetic to landlords where in the eviction process where tenants are committing crimes within the property, and so those typically will waive certain requirements for notices to quit and things like that. The first thing that you do need to send when there is an issue is, first thing is send a notice to the tenant. Good, bad, or ugly, tell the tenant you know what they're doing, or you know what's going on, or this is what has occurred, and that you are notifying them to vacate the home immediately and that they're being evicted. And that's the first thing you do, and document that very well. Make sure that it is served properly, whether it's through certified mail or personal service. And typically personal service is a third party. It's a third party process server for $70 that will take it and document it and fill out the appropriate court form as well if it's a court service. But that way you've got excellent documentation that you can present to a judge in a court saying that they were in fact personally served and notified that they were evicted and in violation of their lease. For holdovers, typically in Missouri, the statute is a 30-day notice to vacate, and then you have to go through the process of eviction. So once you've given them proper notice, then you have to go through the courts and file the paperwork accordingly. The court filing does require an affidavit, typically when you do fill out the eviction paperwork at the courtroom. So make sure that all those documents that you used for proper service and notice are done correctly. Typically also, most judges and most state statutes are a little more favorable to tenants when it comes over to late payments or non-payment for rent. Typically what that means is that they are considered pay and stay. As long as the tenant makes good before the eviction hearing, they are generally allowed to restore themselves to the terms of the overall lease and be in compliance. So just be aware of that, is that just because they're 1 day late doesn't mean that you can evict for convenience and get away with it. That's not going to happen. They're going to be allowed to cure and to mitigate and to pay and then remain in the property under their existing lease. Once you have an issue and you are filing, typically you're going to hear a term called an unlawful detainer, which is really an eviction. Basically what it means is that you've notified the tenant that they are in violation, that they're being evicted per the terms of the lease. and now, subsequent, they are remaining in the property unlawfully, and that's why they're detaining the property unlawfully, and it's called an unlawful detainer. So typically the courts will use that terminology because they assume that the landlord has provided notice and the tenant is now remaining unlawfully. Typically when you file that with the court, there's a process service required. You fill out the court paperwork, then you have it served to the tenant, and then you provide that proof of service back to the court. But typically the court dates are pretty quick. Usually you can get a court date within about 21 days or less in most states, Kansas and Missouri as well. If you file earlier in the month, sometimes you're going to be better off. So I know a lot of people let their tenancies limp along, go pay me by the 5th. Well, you can't pay, okay, pay me by the 10th, pay me by the 20th. And by the time you get to the end of the month, you've gone through almost an entire month without rent, and then you file, and there seems to be a mad rush to the courthouse door in filing. It's better to have a disciplined process, and in fact, it's even better to have not only a disciplined process, but one that's already been communicated to the tenant. In other words, the late fee kicks in by the 5th. If you don't pay or have a payment plan that's mutually approved by the 10th, then we will immediately file for an eviction, and then that eviction will continue until the damage or the issues are mitigated and the additional costs for filing are paid. Now you've got a structured process to go through, and you're not going to be waiting for false promises from a tenant or hopes and dreams that never materialize. Now you're literally following a process, and you're communicating that to the tenant. Here's the process. We're following it. If you don't hear by this date, if you don't pay by this date, if we don't have an agreed to payment plan where you pay $1,000 by the 5th and the rest by the 15th, or you miss one of those payments, the bottom line is it automatically goes into the eviction process, and that's always the best way to handle it, is to handle it through a structured process so that you don't fall prey to the false promises of a very desperate tenant for whatever reason, and you can maintain the cash flow in your property. Once you do go to court, typically you provide the documentation, you show where there's a default, and the judge will come up with a decision. It's usually pretty quick. Eviction hearings typically are some of the shortest hearings in the courtroom. They can take anywhere from 30 seconds for a default case where the tenant doesn't show up to 15, 20 minutes to an hour if there's damages or dispute for damages. But nonetheless, they're very quick. And there's no need to worry. Go in with the facts, present the facts. So if you got your facts together, it should be an easy visit for you. Once you do get a judgment from the court, you're going to get what's called a writ of execution. In Missouri, there is a delay. Typically, once there's a judgment for possession, the tenant does have 10 days to appeal after judgment. So the court's going to wait. They're going to wait for 10 days. And as long as no appeal comes in, then the court's going to issue a writ of execution to the petitioner, who in this case is going to be the landlord. And the landlord then takes that petition down to the sheriff's office if the tenant hasn't vacated, and then the sheriff will then have to process it, and that could take another week. So you've got 21 days to get the court hearing, you've got 10 days for the appeal, 31 days, you've got 7 days for the sheriff. You're already looking at about 6 weeks, 5 to 6 weeks. That's why you want a disciplined process that gets this in front of the tenant immediately. You don't want to wait. You don't want to take promises. You want to make sure you have a structured process you go through, and the eviction starts on a stipulated date, for instance, the 10th of the month, because the clock is ticking, your cash flow is going down the drain, and you need to mitigate it as soon as possible. So hopefully this is a helpful primer for you on how evictions are processed. Of course, at 33rd Company, we have exactly that. We have a very disciplined process, and we have attorneys that are also specifically experienced in the eviction process in the localities where we have properties under management in each of the counties. And some of the little rules and the nuances of the courts are a little different in the counties. But the bottom line is there's certainly an urgency in pursuing this process, and with our company we'll also be concurrently marketing the home and getting it turned around to mitigate the vacancy and the turnover damages. We'll even have vendors lined up to go in and turn a property around as required. And and get that cash flow turned around. Of course, at the end of the day, good screening and better screening is the best way to mitigate ever having an eviction, and that's where a good property management can help you out as well. So we hope this has been helpful information. If you are interested in property management services, please give 33rd Company KansasCity.com a call, and we'll be happy to help you out, and we hope you have a great day. Thanks.